Welcome back to the Wild West Wargamers, and I'm excited to start jumping into the lore of the various factions and unearthly forces that are all vying for control of the American West. Now, in my last two videos, we explored kind of a 40,000 foot view of the setting of Wild West Exodus, known collectively as the Dystopian Age. And I did that to kind of set the stage, and now we're going to begin to look at the different actors upon it. That is, the various factions and power bases that are all looking for supremacy, staking their claim in a turbulent world, all working for their vision of the future of mankind. And I could not think of a better place to start than the Covenant of the Enlightened, the faction that I personally chose to play the game with, and more than just looking for a fanboy reason to talk about them, I do feel like any lore explanation needs to start with them, because it was their work and discoveries that really kicked off the setting, right? Their work is what caused the divergence from our own history. Just a few things I want to point out here before we begin is that all the lore for these factions is easily available for free on the Warcradle website, the Wild West Exodus website. I'm not going to read them line by line, that would be incredibly boring. Instead, I'm going to cover broad strokes, trying to impart the real feeling and mood for the faction. And of course, talk about why these things are so cool. I won't be doing a deep dive into specific characters because they're going to have their own dedicated videos in the future. Lastly, art is somewhat limited for me, so just view this, for aesthetics and really focus more on the audio. I hope that you're painting some miniatures while you listen. So what is the Covenant of the Enlightened from like a top-down view? Well, it's fundamentally a coalition of scientists, researchers, and engineers all across the world, dedicated to the advancement of mankind through technological supremacy. They have researchers in every field like medicine, transportation, weapons, power sources, civil engineering, and more. But it's important to note that they don't have a unified nation of their own, though some members are working towards that end. They're scattered around the globe and each have different views on how much, if any, of their secrets and technology should be shared with the nations of Earth. But again, that's just a high view of where they currently stand. Now, the origins of the Enlightened, I'm going to call them that for short, date to one of the oldest scientific academies of the known world, La Société des Amis du Nouveau Éclaircissement. Forgive my Midwestern tongue. In the book, it's often just called the Amis. This was a collection of scientists and philosophers and thinkers that shared correspondence, right? Just sharing ideas, research, and discovery. This was like an old-timey scientific community, and it boasted some of the top minds in the world, like Edison, Tesla, Eiffel, and so on. Think of it as like an early internet forum, just, there's not really a purpose, it's just for like-minded individuals to exchange ideas. To be inducted into this little group, you had to kind of prove, your intelligence, often by a groundbreaking discovery or technological marvel, and this was a very informal group to be a part of, a way for like-minded thinkers to share their work for the betterment of man. Now, one such member was a man named Barnabas Sturgeon, who at one point made some incredible discoveries at Bimini, which is the westernmost district of the Bahamas. There, he was researching a meteor impact crater and made some important discoveries, particularly alien artifacts. While most of his findings were stolen away by various governments, he hid one. It was a very interesting thing. It's a compass, but instead of pointing north, it pointed south to the deeps of Antarctica. And soon, an expedition was launched with the assumption that this compass would lead them to more artifacts. And I'm kind of like yada-yaing a lot here, but it's a really cool story, and the characters in this are all deeply fascinating. The team arrives in Antarctica and makes a perilous journey inward to the continent center, where they find kind of a few things that are all super important. Another crater, and this one is way larger. The area was covered in a strange material that was later called Element 270, or also known as Sturgeonium, after the guy who, led the expedition and found it there. And it can be used as a accelerant, like a crude fuel source. And the last thing they found there was a doorway. This doorway led to a place simply known as the Vault. Now, while we don't know exactly what is in the vault, it's a super close secret, we are able to deduce a few things, based on the people who came out and kind of talked about what their experiences were. This thing that they found in Antarctica was an alien ship that crashed here. This material, element 270, is littered everywhere. And as the ship was breaking up in the atmosphere, bits and pieces splashed all over, and that's how the compass came to land in Bimini. There are no survivors of this crash, and remains of its inhabitants are never mentioned. But in this vault, the technology of a vastly more advanced alien civilization just laid there dormant. To give you a sense of just how smart these guys were, right? The people who stumbled upon this, and how much raw information was at their disposal, in the early 1800s they learned the principles of atomic energy, roughly 100 years ahead of our time. But here presents an issue. We have more scientific knowledge at our disposal than ever before, and element 270 is a highly conductive material allowed for rapid advancements in every scientific field. The question is, who owns this? If one government had claim to this, they would be unstoppable. And so at this point, Sturgeon called up all the greatest minds of the Amiss, that kind of a conclave basically, to help him deal with the Pandora's box that they just collectively opened. No longer would the Amiss be a loose association of minds, but an organized and structured entity based around the betterment of man by ensuring that these new technologies are not abused or overly gifted to one nation over another. Essentially, they wanted to create a technocratic oligarchy that owes allegiance to no country, but has outposts worldwide to ensure that all countries have limited access to this tech, but they can use it to better themselves, and as a result, humanity as a whole. They changed their name from the Amiss and founded the Covenant of the Enlightened. Now, straight up, the countries of the world don't like this, right? But they do like the marvels and resources that began to pour out from the Enlightened. The kinds of tech we're talking about, like new agriculture technology, weather control, so now you can have, perfect yields for crops, transportation, medicine, all the stuff that elevates humanity. It's awesome. But as the Enlightened learned more and more, a division began to brew. Their research and knowledge vastly outpaced what they were sharing with others, and soon they became hoarders of technology that they deemed, too dangerous to share. Some of the Enlightened felt that it was, in mankind's best interest to keep these secrets away, right? Because mankind would only use bigger and badder weapons for self-destruction, but others felt that humans were entitled to their own sovereignty. Who are we, as the Covenant, to decide what mankind is allowed to know, or judge how it's used? And so there are some important characters in this little schism, but we'll cover those in more depth later in their own videos. But in short, it was a community divided. There was a betrayal by one member, Helsinki Markov, and he planned a coup at one of the ports of the Antarctica site and diverted it to his homeland, throwing off all the hard work at balance that the Enlightened tried to maintain. But at this point now, the cat's out of the bag. One country now has so much more power than the others, and suddenly, world domination is for sale. This division, this schism that happened here, I cannot understate enough how big this was. Hundreds of years of weapons, engineering, and agriculture, technology just dropped. And even then, certain members of the Enlightened began to have their own agendas. We'll cover him in a dedicated video, but a man named Burson Carpathian, his exploits are a little bit complicated. We need to cover the Hex before I can really explain his whole story, but to put it briefly, he stole something from the Hex, and in doing so discovered a new power source that put all others to shame. His plan was to use this tech as leverage in the US to carve out a place where the Covenant of the Enlightened can truly be a nation unto themselves. Remember, this is during the time of a westward expansion. Claiming territories was going on all over the place, and his plan was basically, I'm going to go out and I'm going to do my own thing, my own agenda. I'm going to carve out a place in the world for the Covenant of the Enlightened, and everyone's just going to thank me for it. It's a very selfish, self-righteous kind of thing, but that's the kind of thing I'm talking about, where all these schemes start going off in different directions. But he's doing some super scary things, to bring that plan about, creating new weapons, bigger stuff, all that things. And so his plan was to come to the States, who were in the middle of a savage civil war, that is our historical civil war, which we'll cover in a Union episode, and start selling weapons and technology to both sides, profiting immensely. When he deemed it proper, he'd lean fully into assisting one side or the other at the price of a major territory claim after the war. But he had to get them to a point of desperation before they'd agree to the vast amounts of land he wanted. Wait for both sides to run each other dry, and then you kind of go to both leaders and say, hey, if you let me have, everything west of, I'm just making this up as I go, but west of the Colorado Mountains, hey, I'll give you these awesome weapons. I don't know if that was the exact, measurement of land, but it's the kind of thing I'm talking about where you have to get them desperate enough to give up all of that territory. So selling these new designs, he turned an already bloody civil war into a conflict that was like nearly an extinction level event for the United States. Robotic automata, rapid fire weaponry, zombie-like menials armed with phonic weaponry, and more. Both sides were locked in a stalemate, the Union and the Confederacy, until Nikola Tesla defected from the Enlightened to aid the Union. Now, we don't really quite know why he chose the Union over the Confederacy, but his technological wonders and genius tipped the scales, and now the Union won. And this was the last, big story beat bringing us to the present. It kind of foiled Carpathian's plans because he didn't reach that point of desperation where they had to give him basically half the country or something like that. But ultimately, the Union won, but the Covenant of the Enlightened had a huge part to play in that. And all of those things bring us to the present, where they are still a global organization, but they are severely fractured in their attitude surrounding technology and who owns it. Carpathian exists in the American West in his fortress called the Warcradle. They still share ideas and correspondence, producing more and more technological marvels, and this unchecked progress is devoid of any ethical rules or moral law. And while they do still have the betterment of humanity as their ultimate goal, the methods they seek to achieve this are super varied and sometimes quite horrifying. They'll often create barely sentient constructs, fusions of dead flesh and machines, hulking colossals, the product of dark mechanical research. The plan to rule the world by, controlling the flow of information was destroyed by Markov. And now the shattered remains of the Covenant are seeking more personal goals and hidden research. The dream of a technocratic utopia was gone, and the Covenant of the Enlightened have become kind of the architects of murder, destruction, and ultimately the Dystopian Age. So let's back up a little bit, talk about why is the Covenant of the Enlightened cool? Why did I choose them for my faction, right? Why should you? Of course. I love the fact that this poses some great morality questions. Simply put, who does get to own human advancement? Is it something that should be shared equally across all nations? How much of it do you hoard because you, personally, as a human, have judged that humanity is too self-destructive? There's a lot of really tough implications there. If you read the story for yourself from the rulebook, which you can find for free online, there's just a lot of information in Carpathian. He's a very complex character, and he does a lot of, we'll call it shenanigans, basically, to get his power base situated. And he's going to be a very fun character to talk about, because he does generate a lot of those moral questions. Now, next up, body horror. I love when great-looking models present horrifying realities in the universes they're trying to represent. And, using dead flesh or using the brain as a computing system, but completely divorced from the idea that this was a human and we should respect the body and all those kinds of stuff. It's like all those, how medicine used to be truly terrifying. In our real world, there was that time where, we're just drilling holes into skulls and we're trying to bleed demons out of people, all that weird stuff. It's like that, but incredible technology, where it's medicine is terrifying but equally cool as hell. I love it. On the table, they can almost kind of be, if you were to reskin Wild West Exodus as a fantasy game, this would kind of be the Necromancer faction for that reason, where there's a lot of cheap troops. They can bring them back from the dead, meaning they fix them up in the battlefield and that kind of stuff. I think that is really neat. And what that adds to is this idea that they're not evil, they're not, but they're not moral, or at least their morality it's a very subjective thing, and there's just very different kinds of people all across the world throughout the Covenant of the Enlightened, and I think that that is a really cool thing. So friends, thank you so much for taking this time to let me gush over the Covenant of the Enlightened. I absolutely love them. They're, I think, the coolest models around, and I would love to hear your thoughts on them. What faction should I cover next? Leave it in the comments down below, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you all so much for watching and listening, and I look forward to seeing you next time in my next Wild West Exodus video. Hey everybody, I hope you enjoyed that video. It was made possible by the folks over here to the left. These are my top supporters over here on YouTube and on Patreon that keep this channel going. If you'd like to learn more about how to become a supporter and get some cool things in the process, like exclusive pictures and interactions with me, and get your questions answered here on the channel, go ahead and click any of the links down below or the join button on the community page over on YouTube. Regardless of your choice, I wanted to thank you so much for joining me with this video, and I look forward to seeing you in my next one. Happy wargaming.